Okay, so welcome to our second PowerPoint presentation. This is a PowerPoint that deals with some material that kind of isn't in Wheeler Becker Glover Volume 1, Chapter 2. So even though this is theoretically introducing the Anne Hutchinson chapter, it's really more about why you should care about the Puritans. So that's a little odd, but here we go. So here's just a print showing a depiction of the Puritans going to church. Right there, you get a sense of what was a central value for the Puritans, their religious beliefs. And of course, that will be abundantly clear in the chapter too. So the first reason why you should care about the Puritans is that they're not the Jamestown colonists. And so this is how I'm going to address some material that you won't have read about in the first chapters of the text. So the Jamestown colonists, by contrast, then, were folks who appeared to learn little from their Roanoke predecessors' dearly bought experience. So basically, these are people who are going to make some of the same mistakes as the Roanoke colonists. And obviously, that didn't go well for the Roanoke colonists, and Jamestown will also have major problems in its colony. So, like the Roanoke folks, the Jamestown colonists also had entrepreneurial motivations. They also wanted material success. And the sort of second characteristic is that the initial colonists, at least, were aristocratic men or they were unruly sparks. And they spent more time hunting for gold because, of course, they're following the pattern of the Spanish colonists. They want that material prosperity rather than trying to support themselves. And if you read the first chapter really carefully, you know that that was one of the problems actually for the Roanoke colonists with the Roanoke Indians, that they were unable to support themselves. They were dependent on the Indians, and that did not set up a very good relationship. And that is definitely the case with the Jamestown colonists as well. And because of their lack of self-sufficiency, because they tended to resort to violence more quickly than maybe they ought to have, they tended to antagonize rather than befriend local Indians. And especially in these initial years, in this time of the middle grounds, if you want to use that term again, this was not a wise move by the Jamestown colonists, who again were outnumbered and also did not have the knowledge about the area that would have been helpful to their survival. Because of their economic aspirations, at least initially, the folks who settled there had no thoughts about long-term planning. And that's also part of the reason why, at least in the very initial settlement, there were only men who came on the ship. Later, very quickly, there were women, but this was not meant to be a long-term colony. These people were, hoping to get in there, get the gold out, and then return to England very wealthy. And that obviously did not happen because turns out there isn't a lot of gold in the hills of Virginia. The colonies survived then initially really only because of constant resupplying from England. There was basically another ship coming every year to help them survive, and even despite that, you read just briefly about the starving time that the Jamestown colonists had, where they were resorting to cannibalism in some cases to survive. So not a great situation. No wonder the Puritans look good, huh? The colony, though, did stabilize. This is, after all, our first permanent colony in North America. It stabilized after the discovery regarding tobacco, that really this could be a crop that you could plant, and it was basically a cash crop. It was a product that was very much in demand in England as well as throughout uh, throughout Europe. But then, of course, the downside about tobacco is that you need a very large source of labor. And of course, the men who want to make money want to get that labor as cheaply as possible. And so at first they used indentured servants, poor Englishmen who would trade 7 years of their lives for a passage over to the New World, and with the idea that after 7 years, these men would be free and could potentially find some opportunities in the New World themselves. But then, of course, as we all know, that quickly then turned to a dependence on slave labor. So economic prosperity, yes, at first it's due to indentured servants, but already by about the 1670s, the colony turned increasingly to slave labor. And again, that's just not something I think a lot of Americans really want to remember as the foundation story of our country. And that's part of the reason why then we prefer the Puritans, because they're very different, as we shall soon see. So yeah, the Jamestown colonists should have learned from the Roanoke failure, but didn't. This is just a map showing you where the two initial colonies were, so you get just a sense of the geography. So yeah, all right, let's move on. Because they're not the Jamestown colonists, folks have traditionally liked them, the Puritans, better. And I know from reading this chapter, maybe some of you are thinking these Puritans seem really difficult to like. Maybe that's not the case, but I don't know. John Winthrop doesn't come off looking like a really soft, fuzzy guy. Anyway, so in this chapter, the Puritans may seem like religious bigots, and I think that's kind of how the editors want you to view them. I think that's a little unfair, but nonetheless, lots of folks have appreciated the following qualities. In contrast again to the Jamestown settlers, a lot of historians, a lot of others have appreciated the idealism of the Puritans, that they are founding this colony for religious freedom. And yes, it's for themselves. They're not very tolerant of other religious ideas, but settling a colony for religious freedom as opposed to economic motivation seems a lot more, it's a more idealistic thing. And so from the beginning, these were not folks who had the idea of getting in and using up some natural resources and then getting out, but instead these are people who really desired to establish a more permanent settlement. And so that's a very interesting difference from the Jamestown folks, in that these people, even in the initial ship, came over with women as well as men and children and servants. So this is a community from the get-go in a way that the Jamestown settlers were not. Also, very unlike the Jamestown settlers, these folks were much more middling classes. Some of them were wealthy. Obviously, you had to be wealthy in order to finance a shipload of people coming over across a huge distance to found a colony. But they were not these aristocratic folks. And by that I mean, in England, there was a law that basically if you were a large landowner, the property would go to your firstborn son, not to your second or thirdborn son. But if you've grown up in a wealthy family as a secondborn or thirdborn son, you're kind of used to that lifestyle. So you have limited options in terms of how you're going to live that lifestyle, but not have the benefit of the family's estate. So some of them would pursue careers in the clergy, so they become clergymen. And then some would be interested in careers in the military. But a lot of the second and third sons were the people who came to Jamestown hoping to find a means to an aristocratic lifestyle. That was not the case for the Puritans. And so, yeah, family groups, ministers, and folks who are committed to hard work, self-sufficiency, and even religious education. These are the people that come to New England. And I want to point out that New England, like every other colony that belonged to the English, did also tolerate slavery. But, and maybe this is, providential, if you want to use that word, They did not become dependent on it in the same way as colonies to the south, and that really has to do with the land. New England just had less great land. The land was stony. I mean, if you've traveled through New England, you see all these stone walls all over the place. And that's because farmers are constantly picking these stones out of their fields and have so many stones that, they decide just to make them into these beautiful walls. You just don't have that down in Virginia. So farming is not going to produce the kind of cash crop that it does down in Virginia. And so by the poor luck of having, not such great land, the better luck is that New England doesn't become as dependent on slavery, even though they did tolerate slavery. And it's not until after the American Revolution that laws were passed gradually ending slavery in the North. All right, the third reason you might want to care about the Puritans is because certain quintessential American characteristics are tied to these people. And I think that is something that is a little bit in question, a little bit contested at the moment, but this has been the case for a long time. So, one of the things that's seen as being sort of quintessentially American is, why do Americans work so hard? And that has long been linked to the Protestant Puritan work ethic. These were people who came to the colonies ready to work and ready to support themselves. Why do Americans value equality and democratic republicanism? And this isn't something that you can really say is completely Puritan, but they were more egalitarian compared to the Virginians. They were early innovators in these respects. Everybody who was a saint in the church could have a voice in the government, unless you're a woman, so there's another big qualifier. And they very quickly adopted a form of self-government, as the Virginians will do as well, which we'll talk about more when we get to the next week. And then another question, which again seems very American, why do we place so much value on literacy and education? And again, maybe this doesn't seem very American to you, but it has for a long time. And that's why we have the Harvard University seal here to your right there. Harvard is the first American college established already in 1636, which is pretty amazing given that the first people coming to Massachusetts did so in 1620. So 16 years after people are trying to scrabble through, you've got a university established. Well, college at first, but Puritans really stressed education and literacy in part, again, because of their devotion to a life based on religious principles. So you really needed to read the Bible and understand the Bible. And in order to do so, you had to be literate and you had to be educated. So not bad. All right, changing the, what should I say here? Changing the topic slightly, actually being a little bit more direct about the chapter. I think the chapter actually makes a good point of saying that Anne Hutchinson really wasn't the biggest threat to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And I'd like to point out the visual here. This is a photo of a statue of Anne Hutchinson, which is actually in Boston, Massachusetts. And as you've noted, as I've noted for you, this is the city that banished her. So the city that banished her now has a statue of her, prominently located. But Anne Hutchinson, sure, she did present numerous threats, and we'll talk about those, I hope, in the discussion forums, and you can reflect on that maybe in your own reflection paper. But the biggest threat actually comes in the epilogue section of this chapter. The epilogue to your chapter points out that time and growth actually probably were some of the bigger threats to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So the chapter points out, for example, that the second and third generation of colonists lacked the zeal of their fathers and grandfathers, mothers and grandmothers. So they drifted away, I think, from some of the religious intensity of the first generation. There were also new residents that came to the colonies, and that brought about more diversity. So we saw that there was very little tolerance for diversity with regard to Anne Hutchinson, and with growth, that just happened as a matter of course. The growth in prosperity interestingly enough, also correlates with the decline in religious fervor. I should not comment because that speaks for itself, I think. And as the textbook points out, these challenges don't result in a total erasure of Puritan theology, but they were probably more devastating than just one woman was at the time. So yeah, I've got Note the Jeremiads, the impact of the witchcraft trials, the Great Awakening, and the persistence of the established church. And I think too there's a way in which the Puritan history, the culture, maybe even is still visible in some ways, although I think probably you have to look pretty hard for it in pockets of American culture even today. All right, that's it. Have fun reading the chapter, and I look forward to reading your discussion forum posts.